Story number 1.
The Midnight Caller. It started on a Friday night just after midnight. Allison was curled up on her couch, a glass of wine in hand, scrolling through her phone when her landline rang. She almost didn't answer it. Nobody called her landline anymore, except telemarketers or scammers. But something about the persistent ringing felt off. Reluctantly, she picked up. "Hello?" There was no answer at first, just static, faint and crackling. Then a low, distorted voice whispered, "Why didn't you help me?" Allison froze. "Who is this?" The line went dead. Shaking it off as a prank, Allison poured herself another glass of wine and tried to forget about it. But as she climbed into bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She checked her locks twice before turning off the lights. The phone rang again at 3 a.m. This time, the voice was louder, clearer. "You let me die." Allison's breath caught in her throat. "Who is this?" she yelled, her voice trembling. The line was silent for a moment. Then the voice returned, softer, closer. "You know who I am." Memories flooded her mind. Things she had buried. Things she didn't want to remember. 10 years ago, she had been driving home from a party on a foggy night. On a deserted road, she saw a car overturned in a ditch. Someone had been crawling out of the wreckage, their hand outstretched, begging for help. But Allison had panicked. She was young, tipsy, and scared. She drove away, telling herself someone else would stop. The next day, the news reported the accident. The driver had died at the scene. She tried to justify it, tried to convince herself there was nothing she could have done. But deep down, the guilt never left her. The calls continued every night at exactly 3 a.m. The voice grew angrier, more accusing. "You left me there. I begged for help. Why didn't you save me?" Allison's sleep-deprived mind began to unravel. She stopped answering the phone, but the voice didn't need her to. She started hearing it outside the calls, whispering from dark corners, echoing in her bathroom mirror, calling her name from the shadows of her empty house. And then, the knocking began. It started softly, just a single knock at her front door. When she checked, no one was there. The next night it came again, louder, more insistent. She stopped opening the door after the third night, but the knocking didn't stop. It followed her, to the windows, the walls, even the floor beneath her bed. She tried to leave the house once, packing a bag and driving to a motel on the edge of town. But at 3 a.m., the motel phone rang. "You can't run from me," the voice hissed. Desperate, Allison did what she should have done years ago. She found the name of the man who had died in the accident, Michael Weaver. She visited his grave the next day, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Standing in front of his tombstone, she broke down. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. Please forgive me." The wind picked up, rustling the trees around her. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. And then, silence. That night, for the first time in weeks, the phone didn't ring. Allison slept soundly, believing the nightmare was finally over. But at 3 a.m., she awoke to a sound she hadn't heard before. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, and coming from the foot of her bed. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw him, Michael. His face was pale and bloodied, his eyes sunken and accusing. "You don't get to move on," he said, his voice a guttural growl. Before Allison could scream, the lights flickered and went out. When her neighbors found her the next morning, her bed was empty. The room was cold, her phone shattered on the floor. The only trace of her was a single message scrawled in shaky letters on the bedroom wall. "Why didn't you help me?" To this day, the house remains vacant, and those who pass by at night sometimes claim they hear the faint sound of a phone ringing, just after midnight.
Story number 2.
The Whispering Woods. There was a legend in Millhaven, a small town nestled against the edge of a vast forest. The locals called it The Whispering Woods. Parents warned their children to stay away. Hikers avoided the trails that veered too deep, and the town's older residents whispered about the ones who never came back. The stories all shared one detail: the voices. They said if you ventured into the woods at night, you'd hear whispers calling your name. The further you went, the louder the whispers became, urging you deeper into the trees. And if you followed them, you were never seen again. It sounded ridiculous to Tara, who'd moved to Millhaven only a few weeks ago. She was an outsider, eager to escape the suffocating noise of the city, and dismissed the townsfolk's warnings as silly folklore. But when her neighbor's son, 10-year-old Danny, went missing near the woods, the whispers didn't seem so harmless anymore. The search parties scoured the forest for days. The police, volunteers, and even trained dogs found nothing. No tracks, no clues. It was as if Danny had vanished into thin air. Tara felt a strange pull toward the woods, as if something was calling her to look. Maybe it was guilt. She had seen Danny playing near the edge of the trees the day he disappeared and hadn't said anything. One sleepless night, she grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. The woods were unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every crunch of leaves underfoot. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches that looked like grasping hands. Tara hadn't gone far when she heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Tara." She froze. It wasn't just any voice. It sounded like Danny. Her stomach churned as the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Tara, help me." Against her better judgment, Tara followed the voice. The trees seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder with every step. "Tara, this way." The voice was soft but insistent, leading her deeper and deeper into the woods. She told herself it couldn't be real, that maybe her mind was playing tricks on her, but she couldn't ignore it. After what felt like hours, she came to a small clearing. In the center stood an old, moss-covered well. The whispers stopped. She stepped closer, peering into the darkness of the well. "Danny?" she called out, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the depths of the well, a voice answered, "Help me!" Tara leaned over the edge, her flashlight barely penetrating the shadows below. She thought she saw movement, something shifting in the blackness. "Hold on! I'll get help!" she shouted. As she turned to leave, the voice changed. "No! Don't go!" It was no longer Danny's voice. It was deeper, raspier, and filled with something she couldn't quite name. Before she could take another step, she felt a sharp tug on her ankle. She looked down to see skeletal fingers emerging from the ground, gripping her tightly. Tara screamed, kicking and pulling, but more hands burst from the earth, clawing at her legs, her arms, dragging her toward the well. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and growing into a deafening cacophony. "Stay with us. Join us. Forever." The next morning, Tara's flashlight was found near the edge of the woods, its beam still flickering weakly. Her footprints led into the forest but stopped abruptly near the clearing. The search for Tara lasted 2 weeks before it was quietly abandoned. The townsfolk in Millhaven still talk about the night she disappeared. Some claim they've heard her voice in the woods calling for help, but no one goes looking anymore. The Whispering Woods always call for more.
Story number 3.
The Shadow in the Basement. When Emily and her husband Greg moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town, they thought they'd found their dream home. It was spacious, full of character, and came at a price that felt too good to be true. The only catch? The real estate agent had been vague about the basement. "It's unfinished," she'd said, hurriedly changing the subject. Emily didn't think much of it, but from the moment they stepped into the house, something about the basement door unsettled her. It was painted a dull gray, scuffed at the edges, and always felt colder than the rest of the house. They didn't go down there much at first. The movers stacked boxes in the basement, and it became a catch-all for things they didn't immediately need. But Emily noticed strange things almost immediately. The basement door never stayed locked. They would bolt it shut, only to find it slightly ajar the next morning. There were noises, too, soft scraping sounds like fingernails on concrete, and the occasional faint thud. Greg blamed it on the house settling. But one night, as Emily was getting ready for bed, she heard something that froze her in place, a whisper, coming from the basement. At first, she tried to convince herself she was imagining it, but the whispers grew louder over the following days, always soft and indistinct, just on the edge of hearing. Greg insisted it was nothing. "Old houses make weird noises," he said. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One afternoon, when Greg was out running errands, she worked up the courage to go down there herself. Armed with a flashlight, she opened the basement door and descended the creaking wooden stairs. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam of her flashlight swept across the space, revealing stacks of boxes, an old furnace, and crumbling brick walls. Nothing seemed out of place, until she noticed something scrawled on the far wall. She moved closer, her heart racing. Words were carved into the bricks, jagged and uneven. "Get out before it finds you!" Emily stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hands. She turned to run back up the stairs, but stopped when she heard it. A low, guttural growl from the shadows behind her. She spun around, her flashlight beam landing on the darkest corner of the basement. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light. But then it moved. A shape, darker than the surrounding shadows, unfurled itself from the corner. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Two glowing eyes opened, fixing on her with an intensity that felt like ice stabbing into her chest. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing all around her. "Stay with me!" Emily bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She locked it and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. When Greg came home, Emily tried to tell him what she'd seen, but he dismissed it as stress from the move. "You probably saw a shadow and freaked yourself out," he said, laughing it off. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too scared to sleep. At 3 a.m., she heard the sound of the chair scraping across the floor. The basement door creaked open. Emily shook Greg awake, whispering frantically that someone was in the house. Greg grabbed a baseball bat and headed downstairs. Emily followed, staying close behind him as they reached the kitchen. The basement door was wide open, and the cold air from below wafted into the room. Greg flipped on the light and peered down the stairs. "There's nothing here," he said. Then something grabbed his ankle. Greg was yanked down the stairs with terrifying force, disappearing into the darkness. Emily screamed, rushing after him, but by the time she reached the bottom, he was gone. The basement was empty, but the whispers remained, louder and more insistent than ever. "He's mine now. You're next." Emily fled the house that night, never returning. When the police searched the property, they found no sign of Greg, but the carved message on the basement wall was gone, replaced with fresh words, "Stay with me forever." The house has been abandoned ever since. Locals say that if you stand near the basement door at night, you can still hear the whispers. Some claim they've seen a shadowy figure watching them from the small basement window. And no one who has gone into that basement has ever come out.